State legislatures are the battlegrounds in the fight for our democracy. Daniel Squadron of the States Project is here to discuss. Welcome back to Defending Democracy. I'm Mark Elias. Let's get started. Welcome, Daniel Squadron, to Defending Democracy.
Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about your latest project, which is super important in a minute. But you have a very interesting background. You were a aide to a U.S. senator. You were a state senator. What made you decide to get into politics in the various roles that you have? Is this an aspiration, or was this you couldn't find another job?
Well, I think like many people in politics, maybe the meeting point of those two things. I'd always been interested in politics. I grew up in a very politically engaged family. Both of my parents were very involved in the civil rights movement and politics in New York City, where I was raised. But I was very into theater. I love writing. And there was a little bit of and I actually at one point took a year off college and opened a bar restaurant, and then went back to school. And so I kind of came out, and it felt like the best place to get a job. And I got really lucky getting hired as just the traveling assistant to Chuck Schumer as really my first job after I finished college. And, it's a brutal job, 6-7 days a week, travel to all 62 counties, at least once a year. 2004, his first reelection, we did it twice. But it was also the single best graduate school. After doing that and learning at his feet, there was nothing else to do. There couldn't be a better teacher, someone who's more inspiring to make this your career.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I'm not sure how many of our listeners know, but Senator Schumer has quite the alumni base. If you look at the number of people like you who have started working in his office and then gone on, it's really quite amazing.
And it's no accident. He is, I think he is a uniquely brilliant when it comes to politics, but also he's extremely generous in teaching it, in creating a culture where the team is teaching it to each other, and where it feels like, it's a funny thing. Remember, a year into politics, I said to people, what I love about politics? Everyone is so smart and hardworking. And unfortunately, over the succeeding 20 years, that hasn't always been true. But if you start working for Chuck Schumer, that's what you think politics is. People who are extremely smart, hardworking, committed to making a difference.
So tell me what made you decide to make the jump from working in politics to actually being a politician, actually running for office?
Well, one thing that I learned, both being a staffer and I had the chance to co-author his book, is, this was a nice thing about a democracy. If you really care about setting the agenda yourself, going out and getting people's votes gives you a unique ability to do that. So I had a set of things I cared about in terms of what was important, in terms of the kind of underlying belief in my understanding of the American promise. And as I worked as a staffer for a few years, I realized the best way to do that, or the only real way to do that, would be to go out and get some votes. And I was in New York State, which had really the worst legislature in the country at that time in the mid-2000s, and happened to live in a district with a 30-year incumbent who had been the former leader of the Democrats, who, I thought wasn't helping Albany achieve its potential. And so I decided to run a really unlikely primary campaign against him. He'd been first elected before I was born. And so really what I did is make the decision to run to make the case for state legislatures, basically thinking I would lose. But I ended up winning, and loved public service in that way as well.
Okay, so I said I wanted to spend most of our time talking about your current project, which I do. So you created something called the States Project, and I am super excited to talk about it. People who may remember back in the pre-Elon Musk days, I used to do Twitter Spaces, and you were like one of my highlight guests because I was so excited about this. And so I'm thrilled now that we are on major podcast outlets and on YouTube to really have an opportunity to delve into this in greater detail. So tell folks what the States Project is and what you were solving for, or what you are solving for.
So the States Project has a simple belief, which is that state legislatures are a core, powerful part of our American political system, and that over the last half a century, they've been left to the worst actors in our system. And that was an experience I had had pretty profoundly when I served as a state lawmaker in New York. And we had a group of Democrats who gave Republicans the majority, and frankly, no one cared. We had Republicans showing up with these bills that had been written by ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that were extremely nefarious and effective, and we had no equivalent. And I had been making the case for nearly a decade. State legislatures have this power, this power. No one took me up on it. After Donald Trump was elected, one of the things that happened in that moment is as I was making that case just around the district, people started taking me up on it. Oh my goodness, an entire state legislature from a campaign point of view costs less than a single congressional district. What can we do? And it was an epiphany for me that there was this moment where this energy could be directed towards this really high potency area where normally it wouldn't. And then I was lucky to meet Adam Pritzker, who's an entrepreneur and was looking to have to get involved in politics. And to my surprise, he also got excited about this idea and talked about making it something more than a partisan idea, something really about a broader vision for the country. And so he convinced me to leave office, and we started it in October 2017.
Yeah, and I think that boy, were you? I mean, in some ways, I think your point is you were actually late to the party because the Republicans had figured out this problem for a long time. But boy, I was going to say you were early to the party. Like people, I think after 2020 and after we saw what Republican state legislatures tried to do in the aftermath of 2020, and then obviously with Dobbs and what we have seen there, like it is now everyone is like buzzing around state legislatures. But it sounds like you were way earlier than that in figuring out this problem. And I'm curious, sitting in a blue state, why would this have occurred to you?
Well, it's a few things. When Trayvon Martin was killed, I was in office, and it uh, became clear very quickly. It became part of their party, and that the Stand Your Ground bill was the reason that his killer would go free, and that Stand Your Ground bill had come from ALEC. And at the same time, we were just dealing. I was the ranking member, the senior Democrat on the committee that did criminal justice in the state Senate, and there were, as I said before, these sort of nefarious, difficult bills that really created a wedge between your principles and the politics, and where it took a long time to explain why they were so bad. And it was clear they were from ALEC, so I became sort of obsessed with ALEC because, from just the point of view of governing and the kinds of ideas that catch fire in a legislature, they had this resource, and folks who like really believe in the idea that all people are created equal with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the government has a role in that, just didn't. And at the same time, you had Democrats who gave Republicans a working majority in the state Senate. And I have to say, whether it's the governor, whether it's presidential contenders, it wasn't that big a thing. They were still considered basically Democrats in good standing. Those two facts, I guess I've always been blessed or cursed with a low tolerance for frustration or a very little patience. Those two facts were like uh, extremely clear. And whenever I talked about them outside of state lawmakers, people would say, oh, yeah, state legislatures are also important. They control Congress. Oh, yeah, state legislatures are also important because they're blocking Obamacare. And at some point, that idea of also just drove me bananas.
Yeah. And so you've mentioned a couple of times Alex. So tell folks what this is. This is the American Legislative Exchange Council. It's a right-wing organization. And and I agree with you, it is one of the least appreciated tools that have been very bad for Americans in across a range of issues. But tell people what it does and why you think of it in such a central role in this sort of narrative.
I mean, I think it is the single most important organization in American public life that most people haven't heard of. It was founded in 1972 by Paul Weyrich at the same time as the Heritage Foundation. In fact, for many years, it was housed at the Heritage Foundation. Of course, they're the authors of Project 2025. And at the same time that the extremist worldview and heritage was being elevated or resurrected in Washington, Weyrich and others knew that the way to get new ideas into the bloodstream in this country is through state legislatures. So what ALEC does is it takes bills from the highest bidder of large corporations that don't want to be regulated, don't want health and safety, food and drug regulations and protections, and from extremists who think people should be arrested and serve the rest of their life in prison for accessing reproductive health care. And it figures out how to reframe those issues and distributes them to state lawmakers around the country. It is a constant generator and distributor of some of the most destructive ideas in American political life. And what happens is they go from one state to the next, to the next, to the next, to the federal government, to the national conversation. And that was happening in the 70s. Heritage put out its first plan for the presidency in 1980. So it got elevated to the presidential. And then in the 2010s, the 2000s, Karl Rove took the foundation of ALEC and the dollars of the Koch network, which had associated themselves with it, and used it as a rallying cry to create a congressional majority for a decade, regardless of how the people voted.
Yeah. And, people oftentimes ask me, why is it we see these same bad bills from state to state? And I tell them it's because of ALEC. One of the disadvantages that Democratic legislatures are under is that if they want to come up with a good idea, they are usually having to come up with it themselves. They have relatively small staffs in most state legislatures. A lot of state legislatures aren't even full time, right? And they are developing these, and then they are always sort of starting over. Whereas on the other side, they have this entity that sort of creates template bad laws and then literally cookie cutters them from state to state. And it makes them very effective.
I remember there being a memo, which, describes the bill in more human language, that still had the ALEC watermark on it. It's not even hidden. And what I came to realize is, well, that doesn't make any sense, because if you're introducing a bill, you should stand on it yourself. You shouldn't just take something from an interest and be just a vehicle pass through. But those kinds of resources do help. It's actually a strategy of theirs for there to be less staff in these places. It's a strategy of theirs. They've lobbied to reduce legislative budgets and to define themselves in state laws of legislative services organization, which a few states have actually done. It's about privatizing the work of elected officials who should answer to the people who hire and fire them, and instead give it over to this special interest. So it's a strategy to make it harder to be a lawmaker, so you're more dependent. Unfortunately, as a result, today we're living in the world where lawmakers don't have enough staff. Not nearly enough of them are full-time, as you point out. And where, with the world changing so quickly, new ideas and issues actually are a benefit. So what we try to do is be totally transparent, be totally clear. But at the States Project, one thing we do is try to help lawmakers in office be better at being in office, including helping them source new ideas when they have problems that don't yet have solutions.
Okay, so that's where I was going to ask next. So it's now 2017. ALEC is a problem. Donald Trump is now in office. You've had this idea for some time. You sort of kick it off into high gear now with the States Project. So tell everyone now, how does the States Project operate? What is its mission? What is its, what are its principles, its objectives? How does it operate?
So we focus at the States Project exclusively on state legislatures. Now, that's unfortunately for you probably when most of your listeners turn off, but it's really worth continuing here. So we focus exclusively on state legislatures at the States Project. And we have part of the effort that helps lawmakers in legislative chambers where power is on the line, majorities are on the line, have the resources and the know-it-all to run really effective campaigns so they can get better known. So things like knocking on more doors personally as the candidate, because in a state legislative district, you can personally meet enough voters to turn the outcome. Or using the kinds of data that get used at the congressional and statewide level, but normally aren't at the state legislative level. So we look at all 99 legislative chambers in the country, as Nebraska's unicameral, so that's why they're 99. And we figure out ones where in any election cycle, power is on the line, a majority, a supermajority, something that will matter in the real world. And then we try to provide campaign dollars and, as I say, campaign know-how and best practices to either hold or build power. We are really focused on trying to not think of this as a partisan effort, but in terms of the outcomes in people's lives. So we're pretty oriented around the American promise. I referenced it before. All people are created equal, have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Government itself is both valid and part of the solution. And we try to help lawmakers achieve a set of measurable outcomes in people's lives that we put up on the website to improve their lives. And then when folks are in office, we have a team that does the same, just works with them to give them the tools. Hey, how do you communicate your message? How do you work together to set an agenda based on your own priorities? What are solutions that are out there in the world to the biggest problems you face? And then the third part of our work is a lot of our effort is actually still inspired by something that happened right at the end of 2016. One of the times I was making this case for state legislatures, a small group of authors of young adult novels got very excited and got together and said, we want to create our own giving circle because for a tiny amount of money, $100,000, we think we can make a difference in the state legislature. And they started that effort. That giving circle that they started has now spawned over 300 of them, people all over the country from all 50 states. I just learned actually our oldest member of a giving circle is 108 years old, are now part of that effort. They have decided to take on their own commitment, their own networks to fuel better state legislatures.
So you're in, you're focused on certain states. And I was looking at the list, and it's kind of an interesting list because it includes, pretty smaller rural states like New Hampshire. It also includes really big states like North Carolina, Michigan, Pennsylvania. It has states where the Democrats control the legislature, like Nevada. It has states where there is mixed control of the legislature. States like Wisconsin, where due to historic gerrymandering, Republicans control the legislature. If someone looks at your list of states, like how should they think about what the animating principle is?
Well, I'd say the animating principle is governing power. The ability to have influence on outcomes is on the line. The simplest version of that is majorities, right? So that's an easy, clear one to think about.
We all got that.
In Michigan, the Michigan House has a 1-seat majority. It was won by fewer than 300 or fewer than 400 votes in 2022. It's super close. The Pennsylvania House has a 1-seat majority, 67 votes in 2022. Arizona, 1-seat minorities in both chambers, just a couple thousand votes, majorities. But then you go, and that's also true actually in New Hampshire, which you raised. But then you go beyond that. In North Carolina, you have probably the most extreme gubernatorial nominee in the country running as a Republican right now. Hopefully he loses, but little known is even if Josh Stein beats him, and he would be a great governor in North Carolina, if there's a supermajority in that legislature, that same extremist, horrible vision that will hopefully be defeated on the gubernatorial ballot will have all the power because they can override the governor's veto. So that's a place where we're trying to break that extremist supermajority. Kansas has a Democratic governor who's a great governor, a great leader in this country. And for a couple of years, she was dealing with a legislature who had to negotiate with her. They now have a supermajority, and they've done enormous damage in Kansas. So we want to break that supermajority. And then if you have the mirror image in Nevada, where you have a really strong legislature, a governor who's endorsed Trump, is on the MAGA train, and you're just a couple of seats away from being able to pass the kinds of policies that Nevadans are desperate for over his veto pen, if you can pick up a couple of seats. So the organizing principle here is that it really does matter who has control in a legislature. We believe deeply in democracy, but we also know democracy is a way to distribute power with legitimacy, and that's what we focus on.
We'll be right back with more with Daniel Squadron, but I want to take a second to make sure that all of you know to subscribe for free to Democracy Docket's daily and weekly newsletters. You'll get all of the information you need to understand what is happening to democracy in courts and around the country. Yeah, I want to ask you a sort of a political science or political theory question about state legislatures. I think if before I before I became a lawyer, I was in graduate school for obviously for law school, but also for political science. I wasn't sure which way I was going to go. I'm not sure I made the right decision, um, but but the working theory was that you know, you would have less political polarization the more local you got to government. Because the idea is that at a very local level, basically people just care about making sure the trash is picked up, the schools run and all of that. And so under that theory, you would expect that state legislatures would actually be pretty problem solving oriented because, you can walk down the street in your district or your former district in New York and say, you know what, we have this particular problem. Then you can go to Albany and say, hey guys, let's solve this problem. And it doesn't have to be some national battle. But it feels like now the Republicans at the state legislative level are actually crazier than they are at Congress. I mean, if you look at, to use a couple of the examples you mentioned, I think you could say that the North Carolina Republicans are as ideologically out there as as and less moderate than Congress is. And certainly Pennsylvania, I mean, you have in the Pennsylvania legislature, you have a number of insurrectionist supporters. So I'm just curious, why does that make any sense that in state legislatures you would have more partisanship, uh, where a lot of the problems they deal with, tell me if I'm wrong, when you were in the legislature, a lot of them are nonpartisan problems.
I mean, absolutely. Well, and first of all, just to emphasize the point, in the Pennsylvania House, Republican lawmakers booed Capitol Police who had worked on January 6th, put their life on the line in uniform to defend the country. I mean, that would have sounded like science fiction even a half a decade ago. So,
Yeah.
I think that we're seeing this in ways that are striking and that voters are starting to react to. Uh, One thing that, for example, in Arizona, candidates find when they knock on doors is when the lawmaker says, I'm not here to talk about the presidential election. I'm just here to talk about local issues. Folks say, oh, great, I will talk to you.
Right.
Folks want a relief from the circus. And we know because we actually track who is an insurrectionist, who has said that they want the legislature to step in to override the will of the people in the presidential election in their state. And it's a majority of Republican lawmakers in a lot of swing states who have said that on the record, that it turns voters off. It's new because it doesn't actually speak to the incentive structure to get into political science for the local elected. For the local elected, the incentive structure should be to get out of that negative partisan framework
Right.
and get into a problem solving one. And the change, I think, really just does speak to just how extreme and how anti-democratic, small d democratic this MAGA movement is. It's willing to do things that cost it votes in order to maintain its brand. And the consequences of that, I think, do lead to disdain for voter results or election results of the kind that obviously we're seeing also come out of Donald Trump's mouth.
Um, to what extent have you seen a shift after Dobbs that people are more focused on their state legislatures? I mean, it seems to me that it is a good example of if you think state legislatures are not more important than Congress, take a look at abortion rights. Take a look at minimum wage. Take a look at worker rights. Take a look at union rights. These are all issues, criminal justice reform. These are all issues that are really resolved at the state level, much more so than at the federal level. And I'm just wondering if Dobbs has been a catalyst or if there have been others.
Absolutely, it has. We saw in Virginia in 2023 a really strange thing, which is in a couple of areas with colleges, there was higher turnout in 2023 than there had been in 2022 or when there was a governor on the ballot in 2021. There was no governor on the ballot in 2023. That's a surge of young people who are saying, you're coming after my rights and my decisions, and are seeing politics as much more personal than it often is in the national conversation. I think both things are true. So you say, it's strange because the Republicans many Republicans are becoming much more ideological, much more MAGA, much less focused on local issues and solutions. And at the same time that abortion is becoming a really significant issue that many candidates we work with, for example, are absolutely focused on protecting. But the reason there's a consistency to that is it's about things you can feel, touch, and experience. Now, look, get back to Chuck Schumer. One thing he taught me is like politics in his Sunday press conferences. Politics is about things that matter to people in their lives. People are smart about voting in their interest in terms of what's before them at the kitchen table every couple of weeks. And so abortion is now a kitchen table issue the same way traffic is a kitchen table issue, the same way prescription drugs are a kitchen table issue, the same way a local school is. Now, two of those issues are national, two are local, right? But they're all state legislatures. And right now, they're all extremely salient and real for voters in these state legislative districts around the country.
So you said a few times, you've talked about the importance of candidates knocking on doors. And I think for a lot of people, they don't realize that that is a two-way street. It is both a way to deliver a message and it's also a way to get input for the candidates. And so, you know, in a world in which people are used to television ads and radio ads and digital and emails, talk a little bit about the role that that plays, you know, at the state legislative level, but frankly, just more generally in politics. How do you, you know, why is that so important?
Candidates knocking on doors actually mattering in politics is something that can really inspire you to, you know, have a renewed faith in democracy. And so we see that happening. And it's a great point. You know, when I started running in a primary, having not really been involved in local politics, I probably wasn't the best person to win my office. I knocked nearly 8,000 doors in a 6-month period. And by the end, no one knew my district better than I did. I hit the ground running because of those doors, full stop. We always say this to candidates. The relationship between winning elections and governing is not always one-to-one in politics. When it comes to knocking on doors and meeting voters, it really is. We've had candidates who knock on a bunch of doors because we really encourage it, and we try to make larger contributions to candidates who are willing to go out and meet their own voters, then get to the point of having a TV ad or a mailer or a digital ad, say to their consultants, you know, I know what the poll said, but just test this other issue too. I've been hearing it on the doors. And more often than not, vastly more often than not, that's the issue that ends up testing best or the one that ends up flying. It's really an interesting, powerful thing. It also does something else, which is in a country in which anyone who's of the other party, anyone who might vote for the other person for president is too often considered an enemy or not even a member of your community. It can lower that temperature. So, you know, you have folks who say, you know, I don't like what I'm seeing from the Democrats on Fox News, but you seem great. And then that local candidate can say, yeah, and you know what? You know, I am with the vice president. And it just lowers the temperature and gets the conversation back to the place it has to be in a democracy. And so it makes you better at governing. It makes it more likely you win. And I think that it really strengthens the ties of what a democracy is, well beyond what happens when a volunteer or someone you've paid to knocks on a door. Those are great things to do, and I hope people are engaging in politics as much as they can. But the candidate doing it has a special power.
So you've mentioned a couple of times democracy, and I mentioned that you were on Twitter space. You and I did a Twitter Spaces long ago, and what we were talking about at that time was a anti-democratic movement, a legal movement to adopt a fringe right-wing theory called the independent state legislature theory, which basically would have prevented state courts from applying their state constitutions to laws passed by legislatures. It was dangerous. It met defeat in the U.S. Supreme Court. However, Republicans are continuing to try to press it in court. And I'm wondering how much, whether it's on the doors or in polls or just talking to people or in candidates, how much does the issue of democracy play into state legislative races?
This is a tough one because when it's provable that someone, a candidate, doesn't want to support the will of the people, doesn't support democracy, is obsessed with a radical circus, that has an impact. But we know that politics is both about an argument and about the credibility of that argument. And a
Right.
challenge here is it, we live in America. People often don't consider it credible that we're actually going to have elected officials try to undermine the election. Now, obviously, after January 6th, after 2020, it's more likely, but still, this is the sort of thing that when it happens is massively unpopular. We still do have a core of folks in this country, really across the political spectrum, who prefer democracy. And as we talked about years ago, there's a certain tinfoil hat view that happens when someone says this huge multi-billion-dollar presidential election is going to get stolen by a bunch of people in a state capital. You don't think about that often. It's hard to make the case a credible one from an electoral point of view until, God forbid, it happens, which of course we hope it never does.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I think that, for people who are listening or watching this who worry about democracy, I do think though that what is happening at the state legislative level is actually way more terrifying than at the federal level. I mean, and by the way, I am terrified of Donald Trump. So like, don't get me wrong. I think what's happening at the federal level is terrifying. But I mean, I look at, every day I look in the news and, in Georgia, I just pick the state of Georgia. Georgia, we saw voters being challenged in 2021 by right-wing groups. What did the Georgia legislature do? They passed a new voter suppression law that made it harder to vote and easier to challenge voters. When in 2022 we saw Raphael Warnock win, what did they do? They changed the law again to make it easier to challenge voters. I mean, like, there's very little not accountability. There's just a lot less coverage of the stuff that's going on. You mentioned North Carolina. People may not realize, but North Carolina, Governor Cooper had the ability to break the supermajority until there was a flip of a single state legislator from Democrat to Republican, and it has made an enormous difference in the quality of people's lives in North Carolina. I'll give you one more. I had on, I'm trying to remember who was the guest, but I had someone on, and they were just saying, like, as a matter of fact, and you'll undoubtedly have more detail on this, that there are states in which the Republican legislatures are refusing to accept money from the federal government offered to them under Obamacare, like more than a decade ago, to simply provide health care to their people. Like, the legislatures are refusing to do it. And you're just left thinking, this is nuts.
I mean, this is exactly the point. We actually have a whole presentation about what percentage of all power on each of these issues lies in the federal government and the states, and the Obamacare point is a big one that we make along with congressional redistricting. But let's also just talk about how scary this is, because again, it's hard to be credible for a swing voter on a door in their neighborhood on a Sunday afternoon. But talk about 2020. January 6th, obviously, it's a very scary day. Right before Thanksgiving, the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, Donald Trump invited the leaders of the Michigan legislature to the Oval Office and asked them to, in a way that was outside of Michigan law, based on this ridiculous theory, to step in and change the vote in Michigan for him rather than Joe Biden. That's a president asking for a coup in the Oval Office of other constitutional officials, the leaders of both chambers in Michigan. That same year in Pennsylvania, a group of Republicans tried like heck to impound and subpoena votes and intimidate by subpoenaing election administrators so that not all of the votes in Pennsylvania would get counted in time, and those electoral votes would either get stolen or taken off the table. So January 6th, obviously a very violent and terrifying day, but if you look at the way in this country, we are most likely to actually have an undermining of the constitutional system, of the will of the people, of the democracy as it's structured. It's right through state legislatures. That's going to be true again this year. In a close election in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Arizona, in Georgia, in New Hampshire, you currently have legislatures with a large number.
North Carolina.
North Carolina, absolutely. That's actually great. It's a close state. That's a relatively new but a very exciting development. In every one of those states, you have large numbers, and in many cases, a majority of the Republican majority that have said, even though we have no role in counting votes and certifying elections, because politicians shouldn't be the ones to certify elections in that way, or certainly lawmakers shouldn't, we're going to step in and make sure that this state goes for Donald Trump. And in Pennsylvania, Nevada, and New Hampshire, whoever's elected this November will take office before those states send their presidential electors to Washington, D.C. So whoever wins this November will take office, and based on who's in control of those chambers, could very well try to step in and steal the presidency. And that's where it will start if it comes.
The single biggest question I get over and over and over again is people listen to this and they say, this all sounds terrifying. This all sounds terrible. And I totally hear you and I believe, okay? And so that's great, but I'm not like the head of an organization. I don't have all of this experience. I'm just a voter. I'm just a citizen listening to this and like asking, what do I do? Like, what do I do? Like, what is how do you, Daniel, how do you get people over the sense of like paralysis and helplessness? Like, what is it that people can do to help fight these fights at the state legislative level?
The thing about state legislatures is even today, such a relatively small number of people and small number of dollars are focused on it, that paying attention to them, acting, starting a states project giving circle, getting engaged in your state if you're in a swing state, has a vastly outsized impact compared to anything else. We really are trained a little bit today to feel like observers to our own democracy. We watch the TV at night or the social media feed in the morning, and we feel powerless. We vote because it's the right thing to do. We volunteer for the presidential election or some statewide election because what else can we do? But, I don't think we need to make the choice to just do something to feel better. I think it's all of our obligations to look at where we can have the biggest impact. And state legislatures are that place. In fact, so big that our giving circles were larger givers to the effort to win the Virginia legislature this past November than the National Party was. This is a place where an entire legislature is cheaper than a single competitive congressional district to be able to communicate to voters and make the case. Your influence on outcomes is vastly outsized. Now, sometimes people say, great, I'm from not a swing state. I want to go knock doors in a swing state. Well, that's okay. But really, that candidate's probably better off knocking doors. But what you can do is make the case to others that the presidential election is driven by tidal and geologic forces well beyond the vast majority of us. We should vote. We should do the right thing. But in terms of our time, effort, and anxiety, let's do the thing that's going to have the biggest impact. And that is, without a doubt, state legislatures.
And so people should go to your website, right? And they can give there. They can also, I assume, get access to tools and where to focus.
Yeah, in fact, they can start their very own giving circle. If you're not a joiner, but you're a starter, you can start your giving circle, bring your own network in. You become an expert on this in a way that it becomes really fun because other people start talking about how panicked and helpless they feel. And you say, oh, well, let me tell you something about Kansas. Let me tell you something about Nevada. So yeah, it's statesproject.org. You can start a giving circle. You can just learn. You can make a contribution. And you can go spread the word that for the next 98 days, boy, do we hope the vice president continues her great momentum. And boy, do we hope we can get over the top in Congress. And in terms of most of us and the choices we make with our time and dollars and effort, at state legislatures, each of us is going to have a vastly outsized impact.
So I hope everyone heeds these words and does exactly that. The links to the States Project and all of the other things we mentioned will be in the show notes. Before I let you go, I just have to say, as someone who lives in Virginia and has raised my family in Virginia, I'm from New York originally, but I've lived here for some time now. The difference that flipping the state legislature the one house of legislature that you were able to flip has made a bigger difference for the quality of life day to day than, frankly, as you point out, anything the federal government would do. I mean, Glenn Youngkin was on a roll to destroy what is fundamentally a blue state or a blue purple state and make it look like a ruby red state. And thanks to the work you guys did, you prevented that from happening here. And so as a citizen and as someone who lives in the as they say, the Commonwealth, I want to thank you. And I want to thank you, Daniel, for being on today and for all of your hard work.
Thank you. And also thanks to all the candidates. I got to tell you, folks who are out there put their name on the ballot to run for state legislature, whatever party, that's democracy. And so I want to also just thank them for their service. Thank you.
Thanks for joining this episode of Defending Democracy. Please make sure you're subscribed to our free daily and weekly newsletters so you don't miss out on any critical democracy news. We'll see you next time. Defending Democracy is a production of Democracy Docket LLC.